About a year ago, I was at a Washington think tank, and I was seated next to the Dalai Lama, and he's the sort of person who radiates just this glow. And he laughs unexpectedly for no apparent reason. He's so happy. And when you're dining with him, you feel compelled, out of politeness, to laugh along with him for no apparent reason. And you also feel compelled to justify the laughter by inserting something that might be joke-like in order so it makes sense. And so I was sitting nervously with him, and he was laughing, and I was laughing. And he has a little Dalai Lama bag, a canvas bag he carries stuff in. And so I said, "Do you got any candy in there?" I just didn't know what to say. And so he started pulling stuff out of the bag. And it was basically everything you get on the first-class cabin of an international flight. And so it's the eye shades, the ear pad, the ear thing, his little razor, and a big Toblerone bar. And so when you're surrounded by such people, there's just a glow there. And he's famous, but I was up in a place called Frederick, Maryland, with some ladies who teach immigrants English and then how to read. This process could take 7 years. And I went in and met about 30 of them. And as soon as you walk in the room, they radiate a sort of a kindness and a gentleness and a glow. It's just a gratitude and a happiness, a simple happiness. And my reaction on such moments is that I've achieved way more career success than I ever thought I would. But when you see that inner light, that glow, that kindness, my reaction is, well, I haven't achieved that. And so I would like to achieve that in life. You only get one life. You'd like to not only have a career that's estimable, but also have that inner glow. And so the way I thought about it is with this distinction between two sets of virtues, which you might call the eulogy virtues and the resume virtues. And the resume or the CV virtues here are the things that make you good at your job, whether you're good at math, whether you're good at physics, whether you have communication skills. And the eulogy virtues are the things they say about you after you're dead, whether you're honest, straightforward, capable of great love. And we'd all want to lead a life where the eulogy virtues are more important. We'd all want to be remembered for those. But we live in a society, and certainly an educational system, that spends a lot more time on the CV virtues. And a lot of us are more clear on how to build a good career than how to build a good inner character. And Soloveitchik argues that there's two sides of our nature, what he calls the Adam 1 and Adam 2. Adam 1 is the CV side, the external side, who wants to build and create things. Adam 2 is the internal side. Adam 2 wants to embody certain moral qualities, have a solid sense of right and wrong, not only to do good, but to be good inside. And so Adam 1 wants to conquer the world. Adam 2 wants to obey a calling and serve the world. Adam 1 asks how things work. Adam 2 asks why things exist and what ultimately we're here for. Adam 1 wants to venture forth. Adam 2 wants to return to the warmth of a family meal and drinks with friends. And so Soloveitchik's point is that these two Adams sometimes go together. Sometimes having a great inner character does help you in your career, helps you build relationships. But sometimes there's a confrontation between the two. And I'd say the essence of this confrontation is that these two Adams live by different logics. That Adam 1 lives by an economic logic. Adam 1 lives in the world, in the market. And the logic is straightforward. Input leads to output, effort leads to reward, practice makes perfect. Adam 2 lives not in the market, but in the realm of the morals. And moral logic is different from economic logic, and it's filled with inversions and paradoxes. You have to surrender to something outside yourself to gain strength within yourself. You have to give to receive. You have to conquer your desire to get what you crave. Success can lead to the greatest failure, which is arrogance and pride. Failure can lead to the greatest success, which is humility and learning. In order to fulfill yourself, you have to forget yourself. In order to find yourself, you have to lose yourself. The key is to have a balance between the two. In my own life and in the culture at large, we have gotten out of balance. And if you're overwhelmingly Adam 1, you turn into a shrewd animal, a little too utilitarian, a little too calculating. You live with sort of an unconscious boredom. You settle for a sort of moral mediocrity where you grade yourself on a forgiving curve. You think, well, people seem to like me. I don't obviously hurt anybody. But a core piece of yourself day by day becomes a little less impressive than you would have hoped. You don't deserve the eulogy that you would like, and you don't radiate that inner light that those ladies in Frederick. And so, as I say, I think we live in a culture that is too Adam 1. And it's in part because we're taught to brand ourselves. We live in a competitive world. It just takes a lot of time to have a good career, so we spend a lot of our resources on that. Second, we live in a world of social media. You broadcast yourself, you go for likes. I was sitting next to a young woman on the plane who spent the 2 hours of our flight looking at her phone, looking at videos of herself, pulling faces. And a level of self-interest that is unusual. And we've had a generation, a shift in moral philosophy from a culture that said you're broken inside, you have to work on your own weakness. We've gone to a culture that says you're pretty wonderful inside. And the cliches of what we tell our young, follow your passion, be true to yourself, trust yourself, love yourself, have created an enlarged sense of self. And we've told a couple generations how great they are, and they've believed us. And so in 1950, a polling organization asked American 16-year-olds, are you a very important person? And at that point, 12% said yes. They asked the same question in the 1990s, and at that point, 80% said yes. Psychologists have a thing called the narcissism test, where they say, I'm going to read you a bunch of statements. Does this apply to you? And those statements include things like, I find it easy to manipulate people because I'm so remarkable. Or, somebody should write a biography about me. I love to look at my body. And the median narcissism score has gone up 30% over the last 20 years. And with this has gone an increased desire for fame. Fame used to rank at the bottom of what people wanted out of life. Now it ranks second or third after financial security. And so junior high school girls in the US, about 13-year-old girls were asked, would you rather be a celebrity's personal assistant or president of Harvard? And by 3-1, they'd rather be Justin Bieber's personal assistant. Though to be fair, I asked the president of Harvard, and she would rather be Justin Bieber's personal assistant. College students were asked, would you like to lead a life that involves a lot of fame or a life that involves a lot of sex? And by 2-1, they say, I want the life of fame. And I go to college campus, and I say, listen, I'm on TV twice a week. I write for a prominent newspaper. I'm kind of famous. Go with the sex. It's a lot better. But the more serious effect is that people lose the capacity to conduct a sophisticated moral conversation. A sociologist named Christian Smith asked people, can you name your last moral dilemma? And 70% of them couldn't name a moral dilemma. They'd say, I pulled into a parking space, but I didn't have any money. And he would say, that's sort of a problem. It's not really a moral dilemma. And he said they were good people. They just had not been given the moral vocabulary to have that conversation. Google Ngrams help us measure the word usages across the English-speaking world. We can tell by looking at all the magazines, all the newspapers, and all the books that get published what words are being used. And over the last generation, economic words have been rising in frequency. Moral words have been dropping. Gratitude is down 49%, humbleness is down 52%, and kindness is down 56%. We're just talking about this stuff less, and we're talking about economics more. You know, I just want to know how moral life develops. And I'm not a philosopher, so I didn't do it through abstract philosophy. I did it through looking at people. And I do think we learn from each other. And I wanted to know what are the activities that lead to moral depth. And so I looked at people who were kind of pathetic at age 20, but kind of magnificent by age 70. And I just want to know what activities they had. When Eisenhower was 8 or 9, he wanted to go trick-or-treating on Halloween. And his mother wouldn't let him. He threw a temper tantrum and punched a tree in the front yard. And he punched it so bad that he rubbed all the skin off his fingers. And his mom sent him to his room and had him cry for an hour. She came up to him, she bound his wounds, and she recited a verse. And that verse was, he that conquereth his own soul is greater than he who taketh a city. And 60 years later, Eisenhower said that was the most important conversation of his life. First, it taught him humility. And humility is not thinking lowly of yourself. Humility is radical self-awareness from a distance. It's the ability to see your strengths, but also your weaknesses. And so he came to realize he had a core weakness, which was his temper. And the second thing she taught him was that the essential drama of life is not the external climb to success, it's the internal confrontation against your own weakness. And that every decision you make, you turn that core self into something slightly higher or something lower. And so he spent the rest of his life combating his own temper. During World War II, when he was living here, we think of him as this garrulous country club kind of guy. But he was upset with anxiety attacks, insomnia, drinking, blood pressure spiking, roiled in hatred. But he knew he could not lead from a position of anxiety and anger. He had to lead from cheerfulness and confidence. And so he constructed a persona. And some of the things he did were quite shallow. He would take the names of the people he hated, write them down on pieces of paper, and rip them up and throw them in the garbage can, just as a way to purge. But over the course of his life, he turned himself strong in his weakest spots. And that was that capacity for self-defeat and self-conquest is one of the steps onto depth. The second we'd say is suffering. We wouldn't call someone deep if they hadn't endured moments of suffering. And my example of that is Samuel Johnson, He barely survived the ordeal of his birth. He was infected with tuberculosis by his nursemaid, which rendered him blind in one eye, deaf in one ear. He developed smallpox. They opened a wound in his arm to bleed him. This is the 18th century, and they kept the wound open for 6 years. He developed what we think was Tourette's syndrome, OCD. He suffered really up till 30, went to Oxford, dropped out after a year, became a teacher, and failed immediately. And so by 30, as he said, he led a life that was radically wretched. Now, sometimes people shrivel when they suffer, but Johnson did the things that are necessary to turn suffering into something larger and something enlarging. The first thing suffering did was it introduced him to himself. The theologian Paul Tillich says that what suffering does is it takes you beneath the everydayness of life and reminds you you're not who you thought you were. Moments of suffering when you lose a loved one or have a romantic breakup, they carve into what you thought was the floor of the basement of your soul, and they carve below it, revealing a cavity below, and they carve through that, revealing a cavity below. And so from suffering, Johnson developed great self-knowledge. The second thing suffering can do is it can increase empathy. And the third thing it does is it can lead to transcendence. When people suffer, they have an instinct to turn their moment of suffering to connect it to a larger narrative of redemption. I have friends who lost a kid at age 6, and they didn't say, well, we've suffered a lot, we should now go out and party to balance things off. They created a foundation to turn the death of their child into a narrative of transcendence and redemption. And so Johnson came here, he became a freelance writer and then a writer, and he was armed with the capacity of self-knowledge, and he wrote about himself. He wrote moral essays for The Rambler, called The Rambler, on sorrow, on envy, on all the things that were characterized him, his weak spots. He had tremendous capacity for empathy. At his home, he gathered in strays, a former slave, a former prostitute, people who had nowhere else to go, but they lived with him. And then he solidified himself. He couldn't control his body, he couldn't control his mind, but he took his writing and made it a moral occasion to anchor himself in the reality of the truth. And he shows us through that suffering, intellectual inquiry can be a moment of great, a moral act and a solidifying. And so by the time he died, he was recognized as this great, substantial, solid person, which is the opposite of what he was at age 30. So he teaches us suffering and intellectual inquiry as a moral vocation. The third person I'll mention is a woman named Frances Perkins. In her 20s, she's an American. She was born around 1880. As a young woman, she wanted to do good in the world, but was unfocused. So she worked at a settlement house for the poor in Chicago. She combated sex trafficking in Philadelphia. She moved to New York, but was sort of unfocused. She's having tea one day in 1911, and she hears a commotion outside. And she rushes out, and she sees a fire, one of the most famous fires in American history, called the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire. She rushes up to the building, and she sees out of the 10th floor window what she thinks are people throwing bundles of clothing out the window. But in fact, it's like 9/11. People are choosing to leap to their deaths as opposed to getting burned to death. She sees 47 people go over. There's a guy holding the seamstresses across the windowsill and dropping them into space. A second, a third, a fourth, who's his girlfriend, who he kisses, drops her, and then he goes over. And that moment was what you might call her call within a call. She had this vocation. She knew she wanted to do good, but she was unfocused. And in that moment, it all turned into a focus, and she became an instrument for the rest of her life, for 50 years, in the cause of worker safety. And she quieted herself. She became a little ruthless. She would compromise with anybody, work with anybody to advance this cause. And so that's how a vocation happens. We tell young people, find your passion, look within yourself. But most young people do not have a passion. They can't look within themselves and find the answer there. The better thing is, instead of saying, what do I want from life, the better thing, as Perkins did, was say, what is life demanding of me? What are the circumstances I'm in asking me to do? And that is how she found her vocation. We wouldn't say someone had depth and character if they weren't capable of great love. And the person I use to illustrate the capacity for love is George Eliot, the great novelist, who grew up to a mother who was ill and could not provide love for her. So she grew up emotionally very, very needy. And she would fall in love with any man she met, tall, short, old, young, married, unmarried. She fell for a guy, a great philosopher named Herbert Spencer, when she was 32. And she wrote him a letter that was at once pathetic and also impressive. And the letter was pathetic in that she's begging him to marry her. It's like, please, please marry me. You won't notice me. I'll be around the house. I won't cause you any trouble. If you don't marry me, I'll die. But then in the end, she writes the following. I suppose no woman ever before wrote such a letter as this. But I am not ashamed, for I am conscious in the light of reason and true refinement that I am worthy of your respect and tenderness, whatever gross men or vulgar-minded women might say of me. And there's the moment that happens, I think, in most people in their early 30s, where they stop being reliant on other people's affirmation or criticism. They develop their own internal criteria to measure themselves and how they're doing. And that was her moment. And so it didn't work with Spencer, but she fell for this guy, George Lewis, who was already married. His wife was estranged, had borne 3 children with another man. And she was confronted with the choice. Do I go with Lewis, in which case she'll be labeled an adulteress and cast out of society? Or do I forsake him and just live a normal life? She decided to go with Lewis. And she took a daring leap of love, and that was what paid off for her. And so when we think of someone who's been solidified by love and who's been transformed by love, the first thing love does is it humbles you. When you're in love, you're not in control of your own mind. You've got intrusive thoughts about your beloved. The second thing it does is it plows open hard ground, revealing soft flesh, which makes you vulnerable to suffering and to joy. The third thing it does is it decenters the self. It reminds you that your riches are in another and not in yourself. And the fourth thing it does is it fuses people together. So as Montaigne said, love eliminates the distinction between giving and receiving. When you give a gift to your beloved, you're giving to a piece of yourself. And so it's more pleasurable to give than to receive. And so she made this daring leap. And she did get cut off, and yet it paid off for her. She had a long and more or less happy relationship with Lewis. About a year into the relationship, he says to her, you might try your hand at fiction. You might be good at it. And so she goes away for a week, writes a short story, reads it to him aloud, and by the middle of the story, he's weeping because he knows what she has, the talent she has. He surrenders his career to hers, puts her first, becomes her agent, her editor, her publicist. She's very sensitive to criticism. He gets up early in the morning, goes through the papers, reads for her name, and if he sees her name mentioned in any article, he cuts it out so she won't have to see it. That is a life that was pathetic and needy, but was solidified by love. And so these are just some of the activities that I think would lead us to our depth. People have taken the normal occasions of life and turned them into moral events, whether it's self-defeat, whether it's suffering, whether it's humility, whether it's finding vocation or falling in love. And the people who have lived these lives are in a different culture than we're in, or at least is prevalent today. We live in a culture, a romantic culture. We think we're wonderful inside and the problems of society are outside. These people did not believe that. They thought the problems are mostly within, and they worked on combating that. And that is how character is built, through that internal confrontation. And some of it was hard, but some of it was joyful, because you don't do it alone. You can't do it alone. We all need redemptive assistance from outside, so they bound themselves with others. And they had a great sense of camaraderie and love and companionship. And then they had moments of joy, that inner light that I saw in the ladies in Frederick. And so the last person I'll mention is St. Augustine, who was born in 354 in northern Africa to a mom named Monica, who's the helicopter mom to beat all helicopter moms. And so she wanted to control him, his thoughts, his faith, who he married, what he believed, what he did. He tricks her and gets on a boat to Italy to get away from her. She's screaming at the shore. She gets on the next boat, tracks him down in Italy. And so they had a life of conflict. But then at the end of her life, she's in her late 50s, and he's had his conversion. She says to him, all my life I've wanted to be this sort of man, this sort of Christian, and now you are that. And so she says to him, my work here is done, I'm ready to die. And after a life of conflict, they have this harmonious, lovely conversation where he says their voices merged, they rose above themselves into the realm of pure spirit. And then he has a long sentence that's hard to parse, but it has a word that repeats itself through there. And in some translations, that word is hushed. He says, the sound of our voices became hushed. The sound of the trees and the wind in it was hushed. The sound of the birds was hushed. The sound of our hearts was hushed. And you finally get this sense of this great tranquility and quiet. And the ambitions of Adam 1 are never satisfied. There's always more to reach for. But Adam 2, the moral life, does have moments of just restfulness. And out of that restfulness comes a delight in life, a sense of gratitude, and the inner light that I think we were all born and wired to seek.